Hello friends, we are here today with my daughter Rowena Kannaiyan, who is doing 10th grade in Academy of Allied Health and Sciences, and she's here to talk to us about a paper that she did about discrimination and the research that she did for that paper. And she'll have a delivery of the speech and followed by that a short discussion. With that, over to you, Rowena.
Okay, so when it comes to combating ingrained discrimination, and I say ingrained because it is more systemic, so the speech talks about one, how it's ingrained, two, how it's found everywhere and how it affects different people in different areas, and three, how we can mitigate it or work towards solving the issue. So discrimination is an issue that has plagued societies and communities for centuries now in different areas as well. And throughout history, minorities have had their rights stripped away, their lives forcefully taken, their neighborhoods dismantled, and their identities ridiculed and shamed. And society has taken steps to reverse the damage done in the past. However, feelings of prejudice and hatred may still linger to this day. And as a result of prejudice's prominence in people's minds, our policies and systems naturally reflect those hateful ideals. Fortunately, though, through an improved education system and involvement in social justice issues, one can spread acceptance and fight the discrimination that is interwoven into society. So discrimination continues to be an issue that has barred society from developing and achieving their full potential. And one of the most notorious examples of discrimination is the wage gap. And for every dollar that a white man makes, a white woman will make 80.5 cents, a black man will make 74.5 cents, a black woman will make 69.6 cents, a Hispanic man will make 65.9 cents, and a Hispanic woman will make 59.8 cents. So the statistics shows that when it comes to the wage gap, it includes different types of discrimination. One, there is discrimination on the basis of sex, where we find that, as shown in studies, women of any race always earn less than their male counterparts of the same race. But there is also discrimination not just on the basis of sex, but also on the basis of race, where different minorities are treated differently in the workforce and paid different amounts for the exact same job. And these two feed into each other and exacerbate the issue, which only makes it harder to fight when it comes to the wage gap. And so the statistic has held true since the 1970s and has changed a little bit, but not drastic enough. And despite discrimination being illegal in the workplace, we still find evidence that minorities are being discriminated against and unfairly treated. So this shows that discrimination is so heavily ingrained in our society that it manifests itself unintentionally throughout our daily lives. And though we don't mean to, our internal prejudice shows itself in our policies and our treatment of others. And it's hard to fight something when it comes from yourself and your own mindset. And while the most drastic type of discrimination is on the basis of race, with white people earning the most and Hispanics the least, almost half the white man's wage, within the racial divisions, there is also discrimination on the basis of race. So simply enacting laws, because it is illegal to discriminate based off of race, sex, sexual orientation, but that still happens, because laws only work to stop the effects of racism. So what we need is to stop at the source. Where does the racism come from? Where is our internal prejudice? And how can we stop that instead? That is always a larger task and harder to accomplish, but we find that with large steps, especially in the education system focused towards our youth, it can be done. And for example, Facebook now offers over 50 gender options. So society is making leaps. So that would stem the question, well, people should feel more accepted. We're giving them an opportunity to show themselves as they are in our communities. But a survey found that 71% of Facebook people or users still hide their gender or gender transition, showing that just having the option isn't enough. They still feel unwelcomed and as if they would be ostracized by the community. So it's not the laws so much that needs changing, as much as the people, the community. Minorities may have the option to go out and present themselves, but they need to feel safe and accepted in their community. And that's what needs to be worked on at the moment. Once this is achieved, society will come a step closer to achieving equality and equity for all. And though discrimination is deeply rooted in our society, it can be mitigated through improved educational cultures and social issues. A study done at Queen's University Belfast found that youth specifically who were given direct exposure to minorities and talked about different things such as stereotypes and racial discrimination and sex discrimination showed signs of reduced prejudice and more acceptance, love, and care towards others that were unlike them. So by simply exposing these children to others they were not familiar with, they were able to look back on themselves, examine their own internal prejudice, and that self-reflection was important to evolving their personality and their being. And if we can reduce prejudice in the early stages, we can stop that from manifesting itself later on into the system that we now have today that is treating minorities unfairly and unjustly.
Thanks, Rowena. That was a nice speech delivered from an essay. And question is, why did you go to analyzing wage gap as a form? Because you used that almost like a springboard to talk about discrimination. How did that idea come?
I came to the wage gap because that is one that most people can relate to, because unless you are a cis, straight, white male, it usually affects you as well. And that is one that people usually go to anyways when talking about discrimination. But what I wanted to was give a different perspective on the wage gap. Most of the time when people talk about the wage gap, they only focus on the differences between male and female and not talking about how wage gap also affects minorities and how the two feed into each other and make the issue worse. So I went to that specifically because it does show a lot about our society. And by examining the wage gap as sort of a basis, we can look at how different minorities are treated in different areas. For example, Asians are discriminated against, but yet we earn one of the highest wages, in less than the white man, but higher than other minorities. So if we're looking simply at the wage gap, one might say, why do we need to help Asian people? It looks like they're doing pretty well off. But that just goes to show that different people are discriminated in different areas. While Asians may earn more than Blacks or Hispanics, we also get discriminated in different areas that they may not get discriminated in. And the same goes for other groups. So I thought the wage gap gives us a good look into discrimination, where it stems from, and how it affects different people.
So there is no one lens to define discrimination. People who may not be discriminated in one way could still be discriminated, possibly in yet another way wholly.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about fighting discrimination or working against it, we need to look at this as a holistic system. We need to look at it from every aspect and address each area where minorities are being discriminated against. Targeting one area won't fix everything.
That's good. Now, you're talking about exposures for children, right, to different societies. Have you thought about or have you experienced exposures to different societies? How do you think we can accomplish that for children? Because like you said, ignorance is at the root of a lot of stereotyping.
Right, and also unfamiliarity. Like one of my teachers said, we fear what we are unfamiliar about. If you do not know anything about the other race and you are only getting your information from media, which is inaccurate most of the time, you are going to unintentionally develop prejudice, and it's not necessarily your fault. So exposure can help a lot. It allows you to step outside of the lens that media provides you and create your own opinions, which are usually better and more accepting. So exposure, we find, can be done through a multitude of ways. One, having diverse classrooms. Simply being around other students who are of other communities, of other identities, obviously allows you to be more accepting and cared because you are now personally connected to these areas where previously you might have been detached from. And it's easier to have prejudice on a community that you have nothing to do with. So simply being around other diverse classmates is one helpful, and schools are definitely working towards that, and colleges as well. Two, by having a more diverse curriculum. One point I definitely know is going on in the educational world right now is what are we learning from? Most of the time textbooks can be written by white males and white males only. So we are only getting one perspective. And so if our textbooks, if the books we are reading, our very materials we are using to learn are in itself carrying bias and only showing one perspective, of course children are bound to develop prejudices, not to their fault, but we need a more diverse curriculum. So nowadays, even in my class, my English class this entire year, were all written books by minority communities. And I found that extremely helpful because students who had never heard these perspectives before were now being exposed to what Chinese Americans think about American culture, what Indian Americans think, what Hispanic Americans think. So they're being exposed to all these sorts of perspectives simply because we have a more diverse curriculum.
I think the diverse curriculum point is very important because having a diverse classroom helps, but that doesn't help as much as having a diverse curriculum, because you could be in a very a very lot of variety in the classroom and still learn very little about each other, because there is no learning process about the other cultures just by having a different kind of a classmate, different person sitting next to you. Doesn't mean that you're getting, because there it all depends on your personal curiosity.
Exactly. It does. And also, not all schools can have a diverse community or a diverse group of students. It does depend on where the students are coming from, where the school is located. Sure. Even in my school, it isn't very diverse, and I don't think I've ever been to a school that was very diverse. So that's a little harder to change. But one thing that can be done in almost every classroom, and is easier to implement, is a diverse curriculum. And that is usually what helps the most.
Yeah, and talking about racial discriminations, right? More often we are very easy to recognize overt, explicit racism where either speech or actions can show you. But more often than not, racism survives and thrives not on explicitness.
Definitely. That's where microaggressions come into play. It's a lot harder to fight racism when it is happening right under your nose and you don't even know it exists. And sometimes it's usually, you have to look at who is in charge of mitigating racism. And that's the people that are in power. And now, or most of the time, the people in power are also white people. And they themselves aren't very exposed to racism because they themselves have never faced it, or they aren't affected as much by it. So it has to be explicit and very overt, almost obvious, for the people in power to recognize what's going on, or for anybody to know what's happening. So microaggressions are, what I think, microaggressions are more harmful than overt racism because it's harder to fight something that you can't exactly put a pin on. So things like making a casual comment or talking a certain way, whether it's talking down to somebody or changing your language around someone, different types of microaggressions, they are more hurtful because the person that you're targeting towards know what their intent is, and they usually know what's going on, but nobody else will know. So it almost plays like a trick on your mind, like maybe it's all in your head. But you know it's not in your head. You know what the secret message is behind their wording, but the rest of the world doesn't know that. And so it just keeps happening.
This is interesting and because I happen to come from the Indian context. While here we talk in terms of the white male, so on and so forth as a power structure, I come from a country where the upper castes, where here we talk in terms of race, there we talk in terms of caste, and the upper caste versus, or the so-called upper caste. There's really no one as upper caste. That in itself is an offensive term, and the microaggressions play a big role in the Indian climate where in the power equation of the castes, the other person understands the slights, the insults that are often said in unsaid words.
Right, and microaggressions happen wherever there is a power structure. It doesn't have to be race, like you were saying. And another part of it is when you are doing the microaggressions, it is so easy to defend yourself because you can simply say, that's not how I meant it, or you're taking this the wrong way. And there's really no hard proof of your intent because it's subtle. And the subtleties, everyone knows they're harmful, but it is easy to defend because you can just say you're taking it the wrong way and suddenly it's on you. Suddenly it's the minority that's being too soft or like a snowflake, as people say. So suddenly it shifts the table. It's so much easier to manipulate. And it's one of the reasons why racism has survived for as long as it has. Yes, we've outlawed certain things such as blatant racism and, you know, people sitting in the back of the bus and things like that. That is such a huge move, but there's still a long way to go, and people just have to be aware of the subtleties that are going on.
And even in combating racism or learning to combat racism, privilege can still play a role.
Yes, absolutely. If someone is very privileged, usually by their race or by their caste, they have to definitely work a lot harder to see what's going on because they get this sort of rose-colored lens over the situation, which is oftentimes, even while I was doing my research, it was quite funny to me specifically because there was this whole thing like, is the wage gap still a thing? Is racism still a thing? And I was just shocked or taken aback that there is a mentality somewhere in the world that people think these have just vanished. So which is oftentimes when we see people say that racism doesn't exist anymore or you're taking it too far, usually it comes from someone who is privileged enough not to have to worry about those things. But even me, as one, a woman, and two, as a person of color, obviously the wage gap will affect me later on in my career, and there is still discrimination and racism going on. So, people that face these issues don't necessarily need to be told these exist. They experience it on, the daily basis. But people who are privileged and don't necessarily have to face those things, they start to question where it's coming from because they don't know if it's just taking too far.
Yes. And I was also more alluding to a different aspect, but nevertheless, thanks for that perspective about how privilege can blind you to being, discriminatory. The other alluding point about how privilege, like between two people of the same race who are trying to overcome the discriminatory impulse, somebody with a privilege has a different avenue compared to someone less privileged economically.
That is true. Definitely, especially when it comes to opportunities, there are different ways to combat it depending on privilege, and they tend to take different routes.
Like someone with a bit more economic strata may have access to training or books or classes. It just puts them on a different footing to combat their own discriminatory impulse compared to somebody of the same cohort who may not be financially that on the same levels.
Right. And this kind of brings me to the other point we were talking about where money comes into fighting racism. I don't necessarily think that economic status should play a role in fighting discrimination. It's not, racism affects everybody, whether you are poor or rich. If you are of a different race, people are going to discriminate against you. You do have different footings, but when it comes to fighting discrimination, you don't have to be rich to do it. I know people can pay to go to classes, and one of my classmates did, and we were talking about that before. But when we're paying for something, it gives a sense that it's not mandatory. We pay for SAT classes, but it's not necessary.
Like someone attending a class to learn how to combat racism is in itself a privilege.
That is true. That it does feed into a bunch of different structures, but one other thing is making it accessible. And the huge part of that is not giving free classes. Classes don't necessarily have to be a part of this. And I don't necessarily think, at least the way I view it, you don't need a professional to help you combat internal justice. It's difficult. I think the only things you need to combat racism within yourself is a willingness to do it and a sharp eye. And anyone can do this. And so when it comes to, yes, you have privilege to access classes, even the people that don't have the financial, access to these things can still combat privilege. It's not that you're at a disadvantage or you cannot combat internal prejudice. You just need to do it in a different way. And who knows, your way might be more effective. You can still do it by yourself on an internal level, which is probably the most effective. Instead of having someone else tell you to look inside of you, if you yourself are willing to, you can look inside of yourself and give the sort of self-critique or self-reflection. And even the studies that we were talking about, the students that were having the diverse conversation and everything in the schools, one particular activity they had the students do was self-reflect. So it's not, you don't need to pay to self-reflect. So money really shouldn't play too much of a role when it comes to fighting discrimination. Everybody can do this by themselves, and that's what needs to be done, is everyone needs to do this by themselves on a daily basis when they have a passing thought. Think about that thought. Where does the thought stem from? Because it usually hints at bigger issues and more internal bias. So just take the care to examine your thoughts, examine where all your thoughts are coming from, maybe what you say. And as you learn that you are human, you make mistakes. Everybody doesn't need to hurt anyone. Just understand that you do have internal bias, and everyone does. It's not their fault. But if you have a willingness, you can fight it. Just examine what's going on and be a third party to yourself. don't defend yourself, don't defend your actions. Just look at it as a person who genuinely wants to change, and you will change.
Thanks, Rowena. So at the end of the day, it's all about introspection, learning, being open, both to receiving a criticism and to respecting others.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.